Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back to Rewired with me, your host Khadija Farosh. If you're new here, this is a podcast about the worlds that we're handed and the forces shaping young minds inside them. It's sociology-led and at times psychology-informed, and it's a lot more interested in good questions rather than easy answers. Wherever you're listening from, I'm glad you're here, and let's get into it. Picture two girls that are both aged 15. The first one is alive about 700 years ago in a village somewhere in Europe. She has been working since she was old enough to be useful, in the fields, in the home, looking after younger siblings who weren't much younger than she was when she had started. Nobody around her really thinks of her as being in a special stage of life. She isn't a child anymore, and that's pretty much all there is to it. She is, for all practical purposes, a small adult, and within a year or two she may be married, running a household of her own. There isn't really a word for what she is because there isn't really anything to name. She's simply just a person partway along. Now, the second girl is 15 as well, but she's alive right now. She wakes up in a bedroom that's recognizably hers and is decorated to express a personality that she's actively assembling. She goes into a building full of other people her exact age every day, which, if you think about it for even a second, is a deeply strange way to organize human beings. She'll spend many years there and years after that before anybody really expects her to be fully responsible for herself. And she, again, isn't a child, but she's also not an adult. She kind of exists in this holding liminal pattern that everybody around her considers as completely normal and as a stage with its own, rules and industry built around it. In modern day, we would call her a teenager. And for this episode, that is where my focus lies. The word that is younger than the light bulb, and the category that she seems to live inside. So essentially the whole life stage that we treat as a fact of nature, which in a very real sense might have been invented recently by people for many reasons. Now, I wanted to start this whole rebrand, restructure, repositioning here with this because I think it's one of the strangest examples I know of something that we never really think to question. You can't really get more taken for granted than the idea of being a teenager, and it feels just about as natural as, having a heartbeat or breathing. So if I can convince you by the end of this episode that it isn't really as natural as you might think it is, and that it was built, then everything else this season hopefully might become easier for you to see. Because, my goal with this podcast and this whole repositioning is to show you that the world is full of things like this, and that adolescence is kind of just the one that we're currently standing inside. So let me start with the claim that kind of rearranged how I think, and then I'll tell you why it's contested, because it is, and that's important as well. In 1960, there was a French historian named Philippe Arié who published a book whose title in English is Centuries of Childhood. His argument in this book was roughly that if you go back far enough in European history, the idea of childhood as this distinct and protected and sentimentalized phase of life essentially basically doesn't exist. So he looked at paintings where children were often depicted as kind of miniature adults. So they would have the same proportions and the same clothes and same expressions, but they were just physically smaller. He looked at how households were organized, and how work was distributed and how people wrote about the young in literature. And he basically concluded that medieval society didn't really have a strong concept of childhood as kind of something separate or, special. You were a dependent infant one day, and then fairly quickly you were an adult, and you were folded into the world of work and responsibility. Now, to fulfill my pledge of honesty and critical thinking, I should make it clear that historians have pushed back on Arié hard. Plenty of scholars have shown that medieval parents, did love their children and grieve when they died, and they did recognize that the young were different in a way. So the stronger and more, radical version of his claim that childhood was literally invented and didn't really exist at all before doesn't really hold up. But the more weaker version that survived the criticism is kind of the one that's relevant for us, which is that the meaning of childhood and the amount of emphasis that a society might place on it, or the boundaries that it might draw around it, and the institutions that it builds to manage it, all change dramatically across time and place. And so with that, we can take that childhood isn't really a fixed thing, but it's more of a category that societies continuously define and redefine. And if that's true of childhood, then hold on to that, because adolescence, the stage that I'm more here to talk about, has a history that's shorter and clearer and easier to trace. So where it gets specific is, the word itself. The word adolescence, in the sense that we mean it, gets its real intellectual origin in 1904, when an American psychologist named G. Stanley Hall published a giant 2-volume work called Adolescence. It's pretty on the nose. He takes this period of life and kind of frames it as a distinct developmental stage with its own character. And he describes it using a phrase borrowed from German Romanticism, translated as storm and stress. I'm not going to attempt to say it in the original German. And to Hall, adolescence was kind of perceived as inherently turbulent and emotional, and a period of upheaval and, reinvention. And so he more or less kind of gave us the framework for a stereotype of the moody teenager and the identity crisis. And he perceived it or treated it as biology and as something that kind of unfolded from the inside, internally. But I think it's important to consider the timing. So you start to question, why 1904? And why does a whole science of adolescence appear then instead of, 2 centuries earlier? And the answer wouldn't really be in biology, because human bodies hadn't really changed all that much. But it's more in the structure of the society around the bodies themselves. So by the time Hall was writing, the industrialized world had spent, several decades doing 2 things at once. So it had started passing child labor laws, pulling people out of factories and fields, and started passing compulsory schooling laws, so putting those same people into classrooms for more years with others their own age. And so essentially they've taken a person who a century earlier would have been working and contributing as a near adult, and they kind of placed them in this new extended age segregated holding space, and they're dependent on their families for far longer and surrounded entirely by their peers. And lo and behold, once that structure exists, a new kind of person appears inside it. So that would be, someone in between, who has more years to figure out who they are, because society has basically, for the first time, kind of given them those years. And so in a way that I like to think about it is that Hall kind of thought he was discovering adolescence, like it was like a piece of land that was already, there. But what he was actually doing was describing a stage that industrial society had built. And then what's interesting is the word itself of teenager, which is younger, or not younger as in age, but younger as in time of invention. And it kind of adds the final, almost cynical piece of information here. So because adolescence was a scientific and biological idea, teenager was kind of different in the sense that it was more social. So the word teenager entered common use in American English in the 1940s, and it didn't really come from psychology or biology, but it came from, shocker, marketing. And after the Second World War, advertisers and businesses noticed that essentially there was an entire population of young people who were no longer working full-time and were kept in school, but in a newly prosperous economy had pocket money and leisure time. And so there was a whole demographic with desires and disposable income and no major responsibilities. So the market kind of did what the market does and named them, labeled them, built magazines for them and music for them and clothes and films and other products for them. So teenager was essentially, in large part, the naming of a consumer. So if we zoom out and take a look at what we've got, we have a life stage that industrial schooling structurally created, that psychology then described as natural and inevitable, and that the market, unfortunately, finally packaged as it does and sold back to the very people living inside it. And so we have three different, I suppose, forces all converging on this thing that we now kind of treat as fact about how humans grow. Now, I don't want to keep this just a history lesson. I didn't want to open the season with something safely in the past. I wanted to say that if adolescence was constructed by particular social conditions, then when those conditions change, of course, the stage itself changes. So you can see that it's not fixed. It's still being kind of edited right now in our lifetimes. And once you see that, you kind of start noticing it everywhere. A clear example that I like to go back to is how in the year 2000, a psychologist named Jeffrey Arnett had proposed that we needed a new category because the old one had stopped kind of describing reality. He called it the emerging adulthood, so roughly the years from 18 to the mid to late 20s, and he argued that for more and more people, this stretch or period of life had become its own distinct phase. So it's not really adolescence anymore, but not the kind of settled adulthood that their grandparents, for example, would have had at the same age either. So people in their 20s were staying in education longer and marrying later and having children later and moving back in with parents and trying on different careers and identities well into an age that, a few generations ago would have been unambiguously perceived as, quote, grown up. And the reasons here, again, are structural. They're not really inherently biological. Economies kind of shifted towards jobs requiring more credentials. And so education with that extended. And housing also got more expensive, so independence got harder to afford. And these, milestones that used to mark the clear end of youth, so stability in jobs and marriage and having your own home and children, got pushed further and further back. And so the liminal kind of in-between stretched to fill this gap. And the exact same process that created adolescence in 1900, like we talked about, was a century later creating a brand new stage right, I guess, in front of it. And this kind of tells you something a little bit vertiginous in a sense, because the boundaries of growing up are clearly not really lines on a map, but they move with, unfortunately, the economy and with policy. And so the age at which society decides that you're finally fully an adult has almost nothing to do with your body and almost everything to do with what that society needs from you and, when it's willing to let you go. And this is kind of where I wanted to turn the lens inwards a little bit towards anybody like me and most of you listening or living inside this category right now of adolescence, because the useful thing about knowing about this period and how it was built is that it tells you to go looking for the roots, which, aren't really hidden in like dusty archives, but they're in the law and in calendars and in these ordinary rules that you might run into every day without really thinking twice. So for example, notice that the world can't really agree on when you become an adult. So depending on where you live, you can be held fully responsible for a crime. So you'd be tried and named and punished years before you're allowed to vote on a single law that might govern you. Or you can be old enough to leave school and earn a wage, and still too young to sign the lease on a flat, or even the contract for the job that you're already doing. You can be trusted with some of the heaviest decisions a person ever makes, and in the very same breath or in the very same time be told that you're too young to be taken seriously about almost anything else. And so none of those lines line up with each other, and that's kind of the whole tell, because if the concept of adulthood were kind of a fact about the body and biology, something that we switched on simply, like at a certain age, there would be one line, and we would kind of all know exactly where it's at. I feel like I've said the word line a bunch, but follow the metaphor, please. But the reason that there are a dozen, contradictory lines instead is that there's no natural one at all. There's only really a category that every society differently keeps drawing and redrawing depending on, what it needs from young people in a given moment, and when it wants you working, and when it wants you waiting, and when it wants you accountable, and sometimes even when it wants you quiet. And so the ages move because the needs move, which kind of shows you that you're living in this argument about what you're for. And a lot of the time you're not really invited to contribute to the structures behind it. So I want you guys to think back to the two girls from the start. So the one from 700 years ago and the one alive right now. So nearly the same body, but completely different lives. And the gap between them, as we've learned, was never really biology, but it was more the decisions stacked up over centuries about what a young person is and how long they, ought to be kept in waiting. What I want you guys to carry, really, out of this episode, more than, any date or name, is that these decisions are still being made. So this life category of adolescence and teenage years is being argued over right now in courtrooms and in ministries and in policy documents that we might not ever really get to see. And these lines that, define our lives are being drawn by people working from reasons that often have very little to do with you. And I think that that's worth knowing, because, it's the difference between standing in front of your future, or standing in front of a wall, for example, and perceiving it as, the horizon and your fate and your future. And standing in front of that same wall, I'd like to view it as knowing that somebody else built it and that you can move it and change it and, manipulate it towards your needs instead of, towards serving these unseen people's needs. And so I remember when I was writing the script and reading, or, kind of talking in my kind of update trailer episode where I was introducing the restructure of the podcast, I talked about the worlds that were handed and how that's where I wanted to center the podcast from now on. And so what I meant by the worlds that were handed is kind of adolescence, which I think is the biggest one. It's the biggest world, and it's, the category that is so total we mistake it for, our limits. And if even this, the basic question of what counts as grown or adolescent or teenage or adult, turns out to be something that's built and rebuilt by societies instead of something that's kind of factually true forever, then it's worth turning the same question on the rest of it, whatever surrounds it, the schools and our exams and standards and the futures that we're told to want or need. And so that's kind of the thread that I'll be pulling on for the rest of the season and the rest of the show. So it's not just what we're handed, but, who decides and what they're deciding for and what motives they might have, like we've discussed today. So I think that that's important because once you start asking these questions, it's really, I think, hard to stop. So that was all for today's episode, and next time we take the one thing that nearly all of us were promised was fair and ask whether it ever really was. Leave your predictions down in the comments below, and I'll see you soon. Alright, that's a wrap for today's episode. If you want to keep the conversation going, you can find me on Instagram and YouTube at OfficialRewired. My email is khadija.farrash@gmail.com if you'd like to contact me there. That's khadija.farrash@gmail.com. You can find all the links to my socials in the show notes below and in the Linktree in all of my descriptions. Don't forget to drop a comment, question, feedback, or anything you'd like to let me know of down below if you're feeling extra generous. And if you really enjoyed, a 5-star rating on Spotify or a like and subscribe on YouTube would mean the world. I can't wait to chat with you again soon, and see you in the next episode.